This program is brought to us by CRST International. We're so grateful for their continued support. And without any further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Richard Askwith. He is a British author and journalist whose previous books include Today We Die a Little, an acclaimed biography of Emil Zatopek, and the award-winning Feet in the Clouds, the first book to put the sport of mountain running on the literary map. While he prefers running to horse racing, but having learned basic Czech while researching his Zatopek biography, he felt that Lata's story was too interesting to leave untold. So please welcome all the way from the United Kingdom, author Richard Askwith.
Okay, thank you. Do I start talking now?
Yep, you can start.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the meeting, and I hope you're all sitting comfortably and everything like that. It's a great honor to be here in Cedar Rapids, although it's sad that I'm only here virtually. And I'm very excited, as well as honored, to be asked to talk to you about Lata Brandisová. But it does also feel quite strange, but not just because I'm talking to you from thousands of miles away and I can't see your faces or hear you or anything like that, but also because of who I am and who I'm talking to and what I'm talking about. So basically, I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking to you about a pioneering jockey, a Czech who's been dead for 40 years and who last rode 70 years ago, whose main claims to fame are that she was an extraordinarily gifted horsewoman, that she was a figurehead for the Czechoslovak nation on the eve of the Second World War, and perhaps above all, that she was a woman competing in a man's world. And yet, as you'll probably have noticed, I'm neither Czech nor Slovak. I'm English. I have no specialist expertise on the subject of horse racing or Czech history, for that matter. And you'll also have noticed that I have no experience at all of being a woman. So I guess that when we get around to the Q&A session at the end, one question you might be curious about is, why me? Why is it me telling you this story? And I don't really know what the answer is to that, except to say that I stumbled across the story and I quickly realized that if I didn't tell the story of Lata Brandisová, nobody else was going to. And secondly, if I didn't tell it now, very soon most of the story would be lost forever. And finally, the story didn't deserve to be lost because, as well as being fascinating and inspiring, it was important. And I think the simplest way to explain that would be for me simply to start telling the story. So I'm going to click here and no, try again. Yeah, so now you can stop looking at me if you're a while. I'll be back later on and we'll begin the story. There's a lot to get through, so pretty much everything that follows will be a gross oversimplification, but it's still a true story. And I hope that by the time we get to the end, anyone who's still connected will agree with me that it's a story that was well worth rescuing from oblivion. And if there's anything that isn't clear, then you're very welcome to ask me that then, or alternatively, you're very welcome to read a fuller version of the story in my book. But meanwhile, here is the ultra high-speed version of the life of Lata Brandisová. So hold tight, and I hope you can follow it. So Lata Brandisová was born in Bohemia in 1895. She was the fifth child of an impoverished count in the twilight years of the Habsburg Empire. Her full name was Maria Immaculata, but everyone called her Lata. She grew up in a small stately home in Žička, just outside Prague, where her father kept a few horses. She was a natural athlete, this is her there, and excelled at all outdoor pursuits, but her greatest gift, which she displayed from a very early age, was her miraculous rapport with horses. She was almost like a horse whisperer. Even the most troublesome horses loved her and seemed glad to do anything she asked them to do. When Lata was 11, Prague's first proper race course opened just up the road from Jitka, and her father, who was a keen horseman himself, began to take her to watch. And they carried on doing this for quite a few years. And at some point in her teens, Lata seems to have decided that it would be nice to ride in races herself. You can understand why, because she was brave, tough, athletic, brilliant with horses. But there was one key drawback. She was a woman, and women weren't allowed to race. This obviously frustrated her, because she and her sisters used to dress up as men, painting moustaches on their faces. This one's Lata here, to take part in what they called officer races on their ponies. But that was initially as close as Lata Brandisová got to being a jockey. But of course, after the First World War, a whole new world opened up. The Habsburg Empire collapsed. A new democratic First Republic of Czechoslovakia was founded. Aristocratic titles were abolished. Noble families lost a lot of their lands. Women were given the vote, and distinctions based on gender were theoretically abolished. But although this last development was welcomed by feminist campaigners, it doesn't seem to have made a great deal of difference in practice. Horse racing in Czechoslovakia continued exactly as it had done under the Habsburgs, as a sport for men. But there was at least talk in the air of opportunities for women. Meanwhile, Lata spent a lot of time hanging around the race course, and one of the top trainers, Karol Schmader, started letting her exercise his horses because he could see how good she was. So she did this for several years, cycling 12 miles to get there every day and 12 miles back. But riding in a proper race still wasn't an option for her. And there was certainly absolutely no question of her riding in the race that would later become so important to her story, which took place every October in Pardubice, about 80 miles to the east. I imagine that most of you won't need to be told about the Grand Pardubice steeplechase, but just in case, I'll just quickly explain that it's a spectacular autumn horse race that was first run in 1874 and is still held today, and is basically the Czechs' big national sporting event. Its big selling point was and is that it's ridiculously dangerous. After getting on for a century and a half, there has never yet been a year when all the runners have finished. It was inspired by the British Grand National and partly modelled on it, but it's generally considered a lot more extreme. It's 4 and a bit miles with about 30 obstacles. It sort of varies from year to year. And in Lata's day, roughly half of it was run over ploughed fields, sort of outside the racecourse around here. So the horses were usually exhausted before they even attempted most of the jumps. And a lot of the jumps were pretty severe, even for a fresh horse. And as most of you probably know, the most notorious jump of all was and is the obstacle known as Taxis Ditch, which combines a 4.5-foot hedge with the most enormous ditch, which the horses don't even see until they're already in midair. It's been toned down a lot since Lata's day, as has most of the race, but even now it's still pretty extreme. And visiting foreign jockeys who are shown Taxis for the first time often refuse to believe that it really is something that they're expected to jump. So at the very least, you could say that this wasn't a race for the faint-hearted. And I think it's also worth digressing very quickly to point out that this was also a race with a very international profile. And it always had been to some extent, because there were lots of comings and goings between the Habsburg upper classes and the British upper classes before the First World War. But during the period when this story was set, between the wars, the race developed a particularly international flavour, because this was a time when a lot of people far beyond Czechoslovakia took an interest in what happened in Czechoslovak society and politics. Tomáš Masaryk's First Republic had been set up with the backing of the British, French, and Americans. And Czechoslovakia was widely seen as a kind of showcase for Western ideals of liberal democracy and social reform. Prague was seen rightly as a jewel of Europe's shared cultural heritage, just as Vienna or Paris were. And Czechoslovak industry and technology were much admired. And grand towns such as Pardubice gradually became a fashionable destination for Europe's elites. Again, I'm sure most of you don't need me to tell you this, but I think it's worth emphasizing anyway, because it gives Lata Brandisová's story an extra layer of significance, because all of this international awareness meant that people far beyond Czechoslovakia took an interest in what happened in the Velká Pardubice, in the same way that today people far beyond America take an interest in who wins the US Open. And then when the race began to develop a greater political significance in the 1930s, people were aware of that too. And then that in turn made it even more significant. And so all this meant that when Lata finally did make it into the limelight, the world would be watching. But I'm sorry, I'm getting very ahead of myself. Let's get back to the story. Where was I? Yes, so I'm pretty sure that when Lata first started exercising horses at her local racecourse, she didn't have any ambitions to ride in the Velká Pardubice. But she did have a special interest in the race because she was related through her father to the Kinsky family. As some of you probably know, the Kinskys were spectacularly rich and influential aristocrats, and they were particularly influential in the world of horse racing. Octavian Kinsky, who was a kind of hell-raising lunatic who liked driving his coach and four up and down his palace staircases, had co-founded the Velká Pardubice in 1874. And after the war, his great-nephew, Zdenko Radslav Kinsky, who was Lata's cousin, became one of Czechoslovakia's leading horse race owners and breeders. And the Kinskys also had their own breed of horse, the Kinsky horse, which is very gentle-natured and typically has this sort of beautiful golden buckskin coloring. And Zdenko Radslav Kinsky used to breed and train these Kinsky horses not far from Pardubice, and his big ambition was for one of them to win the Velká Pardubice. So, in 1926, Lata started visiting the Kinskys and began to ride their horses just on a sort of social basis. And Zdenko Radslav Kinsky couldn't help noticing how talented she was, and especially how good she was with some of his more temperamental horses. So he decided eventually that he wanted Lata to ride one of his horses in the Velká Pardubice. This was an absolutely preposterous idea. Lata, by the way, she's 31 by now. She's never ridden in an official horse race before. And as far as most people are concerned, she never can because she's a woman. But somehow in 1927, with Zdenko Radslav Kinsky's help, she manages to get a jockey's license because it wasn't actually illegal for a woman to race. It just was considered unacceptable in the male-dominated racing world. So Lata rode her first race ever that May in a tiny little women-only flat race in Velká Hukla. And the racing press denounced even this as a circus, but there wasn't too much fuss because it was just a little thing. But then a few months later, the news comes out that Lata Brandisová is planning to ride in the 1927 Velká Pardubice, and this provokes a huge scandal. People object for all sorts of reasons. Some people don't think women should be racing at all. Others object to a delicate woman being exposed to the specific dangers of this particular notorious race. And then there's also the argument that Lata's inevitable incompetence would expose the proper riders to extra risk. Anyway, the Association of Men's Riders kicks up a big fuss, but the angriest reaction comes from the male jockeys themselves, the ones that Lata would be riding against, many of whom are cavalry officers. Because one thing to keep in mind about the Velká Pardubice steeplechase is that it was basically conceived as a preparation for war back in the days when wars were still won and lost on horseback. And in military circles, the race was still considered the ultimate test of manhood and fighting spirit. There was a big military riding school in Pardubice, and in the 1920s, the officers who trained there dominated the culture of the race. You can see a few of them riding here, but they're also in the background of almost any other picture you see from Pardubice racecourse between the wars. Here, for example, or here. And basically the idea was that if you were man enough to ride in the Velká Pardubická steeplechase, you were man enough to die for your country. And to do either of those things was considered a great honor. But now the officers that Lata wanted to ride against felt that their honor was under threat. They complained that they would be dishonored forever if a mere woman was allowed to ride against them, and especially if she was badly hurt. And of course, if by some freak misfortune one of them was beaten by her, the shame would be intolerable. So there were lots of heated arguments about this, and the press was full of it. And Zdenko Radslav Kinski ended up getting the English Jockey Club to intervene. But they basically said that it would be fine by them if Lata rode, because no English woman was mad enough to want to ride in a race like that. So it didn't really matter. They did insist that Lata must have her own separate dressing room, but basically they gave it the go-ahead. But even that didn't really calm things down, and the officers were still making protests on the day of the race. But Lata stood her ground, and she raced, despite all the hostility, which must have been very off-putting. And she fell quite badly at Taxis, which is the fourth jump, but she remounted and resumed the race. And she went on to fall 4 more times in that race. Here she is in one of the water jumps. And each time she picked herself up and carried on. And eventually she was 5th out of only 5 finishers from a field of 13. And after that, the talk about dishonor quietened down quite a bit, because quite a few of the officers had done worse than her. And in any case, Lata had at least shown herself to be tough and brave, and the general public seemed to respect her for that. So after a few years, she came back and tried again. And eventually, even the cavalry officers began to accept her too. So she next rode in the race in 1930, there she is, and she came 4th. And then again in 1931, when she came 3rd. And then in 1933, she came 3rd again. And this time she was riding a little Kinski mare, Norma, with whom she struck up a very special relationship. And you really could almost say that they were best friends. Because Lata was a very shy and awkward person, really, and she seems to have been much more at ease with horses than she was with people. And this friendship came to mean so much to Lata, but eventually she began to believe that, as she put it, we 2 girls might actually win this race, this big test of manhood one day. But she still can't quite manage it. In 1934, Lata and Norma come 2nd. In 1935, they can only manage 5th, because this time they have to remount after falling at Taxis. This is Lata here, I think. And then in 1936, Lata doesn't even race at all, which is a bitter disappointment to her, because Kinski gets a male jockey to ride Norma instead. Lata is 41 by now, and Kinski is desperate to win the race. And he thinks that a young, strong man might do better, although it turns out that he doesn't do better at all. And there's an important reason why Kinski is so keen to win, because by the time we get to the mid-1930s, the Velká Pardubická wasn't just about sport, it was also about politics. Hitler had been in power in Germany for several years now, and the shadow of the Third Reich was spreading across Central Europe. And as you probably know, the Nazis put huge effort and resources into propaganda, and sport was a crucial part of their propaganda program. So the Berlin Olympics in August 1936 was the most notorious example. But all forms of sporting competition were now being used to promote Nazi ideology and the myth of the German master race. And equestrian sports were probably the worst of all. Since 1934, every German civilian who rode competitively had to belong either to the equestrian SA, who are better known as the brown shirts, or more commonly to the equestrian SS. So obviously some of them joined these basically paramilitary organizations reluctantly, but surprisingly many of the top riders were actually enthusiastic and active Nazis. And Goebbels and Himmler vied with one another to claim German victories in the saddle as evidence of what one SS magazine called the new spirit of our nation. And Hermann Fegelein, it's him here, who successfully arranged somehow a clean sweep of German golds in the Olympic equestrian events in 1936, and who would later lead an SS cavalry regiment to commit terrible wartime atrocities in the East, became one of Hitler's closest associates. And with all this in the background, the Grand Pardubice steeplechase had taken on a sinister new significance. So basically, Pardubice in the 1930s became an arena where the Third Reich sent its finest paramilitary riders to demonstrate the invincible superiority of Germany's Aryan warrior horsemen, especially in relation to what Hitler called the subhuman Slavs. I mean, all this probably sounds quite far-fetched as well as offensive, but this really was the actual language that the Nazi leaders used. And given that the Third Reich was by now openly plotting the dismemberment and probable invasion of Czechoslovakia, this trend was quite distressing and alarming for anyone, Czechoslovak or otherwise, who valued Czechoslovak democracy. But that's what happened. All through the 1930s, the Grand Pardubice acquired this extra ideological dimension as a kind of battlefield in the fight for hearts and minds between Democrats and fascists. And all through the 1930s, the fascists kept winning. So year after year, a German horse ridden by an SS or a brown shirt officer would win the big race, and Nazi media would celebrate, and Czechoslovak morale would crumble a little further from the blow. But the blows kept coming. And then in 1937 came the biggest blow of all. Just a few weeks before that year's big race, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, the founder, liberator, ex-president who was synonymous with Czechoslovak democracy, died. 2 million people brought Prague to a standstill for Masaryk's funeral. The father of their nation had left them, and the Nazi threat was growing. And it must almost have felt as though a whole world was coming to an end. And then, barely 3 weeks later, came the 1937 Grand Pardubice. So this really was one of the most politically charged moments in sporting history. Pardubice was overwhelmed by crowds of spectators. The Germans had sent their strongest ever party of horses and riders, hoping to break Czechoslovak morale for once and for all. The Czechoslovaks were desperate to beat them. In the official race day program, it talked about the Battle of Pardubice and about how the invaders needed to be repelled. But in actual sporting terms, this was easier said than done. The Czechoslovaks still had their cavalry officers riding, but none of them was good enough or had a good enough horse to offer serious resistance. So it looked as though it might be quite a dark and depressing day for the Czechoslovak people. But there was also one other contender, Lata Brandisová, a 42-year-old ex-countess riding a little golden mare. A lot of people had assumed that Lata had retired after her non-appearance the previous year, but here she was riding her friend Norma again, basically carrying her nation's hopes in a confrontation that must have felt much more than usual, like a matter of life and death. So Lata, this is her here, rides in her 9th Grand Pardubice, or Velká Pardubická steeplechase, and it's as brutal as ever. And there are some nasty falls and some dirty tricks, notably from a professional jockey called Willibald Schlagbaum, who was a keen Nazi who seems to have had who came across Lata a lot riding in Czechoslovakia anyway, who seems to have had a particular grudge against Lata, probably because she was a woman. But Lata manages to avoid being pushed off the course, and somehow, against all the odds, Lata and Norma win. So the celebrations are enormous all over Czechoslovakia, and the woman wins Grand Pardubice steeplechase headlines appear all over Europe. And there are interviews and photo shoots and social events in her honor. And Lata becomes briefly an international celebrity. But for her fellow Czechoslovaks, she's also become this almost Joan of Arc-like symbol of national defiance. But beyond the rejoicing, there's a lot to be anxious about. Within days of Lata's victory, the Nazis' anti-Czech hate campaign had reached unprecedented levels of intensity. There's no specific evidence that I'm aware of that Lata's victory directly provoked Hitler into stepping up his plans for invasion. But nonetheless, that is what he immediately did. And it's certainly hard to imagine a greater humiliation for the Nazis, and especially for Himmler and Fegelein and the SS, than for their finest warriors to have been humiliated and basically dishonored, I guess, by a Czech woman. Anyway, you know what happened next. Within 18 months, the whole of Czechoslovakia is under Nazi occupation. And Lata's home at Žižka is one of the very first estates to be seized and put under Nazi administration, because she and her family are seen as symbols of defiance against the Nazis. And the years of Nazi occupation are difficult for Lata, but basically she has what in England we used to call a good war. So, you know, unlike the majority of ex-aristocrats who tended to support the Nazis. So Lata helps the resistance when she can, and then she does her bit for the liberation in May 1945. But after the war, things are never quite the same. She gets her estate back, but it's in an absolutely terrible state and facing ruin. And of course, the rest of the country was in a pretty terrible state too. But Lata did get to ride again in the Velká Pardubická in 1946, but she had a bad fall. And then again in 1947, when her horse was a bit crazy, and again, she didn't finish. And then, of course, in 1948, the communists take over. So Lata, as an ex-countess, is immediately seen as a class enemy. And so from then on, nobody really dares to celebrate her achievements anymore. And the Kinski's horses become the property of the state. And Lata never gets to ride in the Velká Pardubická steeplechase again. So she just stays at home quietly with her horses. She does have one last ride in Pardubice in 1949, but it's not in the Velká Pardubická itself, but in a shorter race at the same meeting over the same course. And she has a terrible fall at one of the water jumps, the snake ditch, which leaves her in a coma for a week. The paragraph in my book that lists her injuries goes on for nearly a page, and she never fully recovers, and she never rides again, which I think she found heartbreaking. And meanwhile, the communists are stepping up their class war against people like Lata. So the state gradually takes over her property and turns it into a collective farm and a hostel for agricultural workers. and she and her sisters are squeezed into a couple of rooms at one end of the building. And then in 1953, she's evicted from her home altogether, and the family house is looted, and she spends the next 27 years living with two of her sisters in a tiny cottage in the woods a few miles from her village, without even electricity or running water. And the racing world carries on without her, and the Velká Pardubice carries on without her, even under communism. But no one dares talk about her or celebrate her achievements. And so gradually over the years, a new generation of race girls grows up who have never heard of her. And so Lata lives out the final third of her life in poverty and obscurity. She never complains. Everyone who knew her emphasizes that. She never complains. But she's frail and she can't walk without a stick. And sometimes she and her sisters are cold or hungry. And the older they get, the harder it becomes. And eventually, in late 1980, a nephew who lives in Austria comes and takes Lata away to live with him in a place called Third Reich, where she spends the last months of her life. She seems to have been quite happy here, mainly because there were horses. And it's here that she died in May 1981. Her death was almost entirely unnoticed in Czechoslovakia. There were a couple of down-page sentences on the sports pages, but that was all. So this woman, who had once been her nation's great hero and figurehead in 1937, died as a forgotten outcast. And fast forward a few decades, and she's still barely remembered. A few hardcore racing buffs do know that there was a woman called Lata Brandisová who won the Velká Pardubice steeplechase in 1937. But that, until I wrote my book, that was really about all that most of them knew about her. And one or two people have attempted recently to rescue her from complete oblivion. But of course, the trouble is that once someone's story stops being remembered, it's very hard to rescue it, and especially once people who knew her start growing old and dying. And for me, that was one of the most fascinating things about Lata's story. How could someone who had such a sensational impact vanish so quickly and so completely from collective memory? And I think when you start trying to unpick that, I think it becomes a really fascinating way of looking at the extraordinary and uplifting and tragic and inspiring story of the Czech and Slovak nations in the 20th century. In the woods above Lata's old home at Žižka, there is still a Brandis family tomb where a few local admirers now gather once a year to say a mass in her memory. But Lata isn't actually buried there. She's buried where she died, in exile in Austria. Yet there is one mark that Lata made on history that has never faded, because like every pioneer of equal opportunities, she made a difference to those who came after. And even in the years when no one dared mention her name, the taboo that she had broken remained broken. And women in Czechoslovakia who wanted to take part in horse races were able to do so without controversy. It wasn't until 1977 that the first woman rode in the British Grand National, and there was a huge outcry and scandal when she did so. That was 50 years after Lata first established a woman's right to ride in the Velká Pardubice. That's the woman in question, Charlotte Brew, in the main picture, riding in Pardubice a few months later. And you can see that her race in Pardubice didn't end too well. But she told me that she's never forgotten the warm welcome the Czechoslovaks gave her, in marked contrast to the horrible abuse she got in England. And that seems to me to be a legacy of Lata's that's worth celebrating. There are still plenty of people in horse racing and in sport generally who believe that women aren't tough enough to win the contests that really matter. and the best opportunities are still far more likely to be given to a man. Yet change is coming, and in horse racing, given that the vast majority of young people who now take up riding are female, it looks unstoppable. So I think we can be confident that sooner or later, another woman will one day win the Velká Pardubice, or perhaps a female jockey will win the English Grand National. And yet it's still true that for the time being, after 180 years of the Grand National and 146 years of the Velká Pardubice, Lata Brandisová remains the only woman ever to have won one of Europe's great extreme steeplechases. And she did so at a time when those races were much tougher than they are today, against the most intimidating opposition imaginable, carrying the weight of her nation's hopes at a moment of huge political danger and tension. And in doing so, she not only gave hope to her people, but she proved beyond doubt that even in the toughest challenges, a woman in the saddle can do everything a man can do and more. Female high achievers often get a raw deal from history, but Lata Brandisová got a rawer deal than most. Through a combination of talent and sheer courage, she became an icon for her nation and for her gender. And when her nation needed a hero in one of its darkest hours, she had the courage and the determination to give her people hope. And her award was to be made into an outcast. She was born into privilege, but she spent much of her life in poverty, and she endured many hardships, but she never complained, she never gave up, and she never took no for an answer. Instead, she repeatedly did things that others said couldn't be done. And I believe that for all those reasons, hers was a life worth remembering. And I hope that my book will rescue her from the undeserved oblivion into which she had previously vanished. So basically, that's the high-speed story of Lata Brandisová. Whoops, and I hope I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. Is that right?
Yes.
I can't. And I'm handing you back to Teresa for a moment.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Obviously, I knew a little bit just based on reading the description, but I'm really looking forward now to reading your book, and I really appreciate you being here today. So now we can open it up if anyone has any questions. I personally will start because I did have one. Have you yourself attended either of those races, in person and kind of seen, what
Yes,
they're
no,
like?
I've been to the Velká Pardubice a couple of times, and I've been to the course many times.
Mhm.
I mean, it is very different today from what it was in Lata's day, and you can see little bits of footage of what it was like in the 1930s. But you go there today, and it almost looks like a normal horse race, except that there's this wonderful atmosphere. I mean, the sense of it being a national sporting coming together is absolutely there, and it must have been so different this year when they held it with social distancing and a minimal crowd. But normally it's just so packed, and it takes an hour to walk half a mile from the train station to get to the course, and there's a great atmosphere there.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask Richard?
Don't be shy.
I have a question. Do you, understanding this was more than a few years ago, do you think she saw herself as groundbreaking, or I'll say it, a feminist, or breaking, or just doing what she did?
That's a good question. It's a very hard one to answer. I think left to herself, she would probably just entirely as herself, she probably would have just have been doing what she did. But one of the things I look at in my book is the way that her racing career happened to coincide with a sort of era of a short-lived era of feminism, and there were, you know, these other female figures doing things in life, from, you know, Milada Horakova in politics to Eliška Junkova in motor racing, and things like, you know, the Women's World Games, which was like the women's versions of the Olympics. I think they were held in Prague in 1930. It was an era, at least until the sort of the fascist backlash, when it felt like a time of opportunity for women. And so I think she sort of rode that wave a bit ultimately, but that probably wasn't her. I don't think she originally saw herself as a social crusader. I think she just wanted to ride horses.
Great, thank you. And just unrelated, a second question. How, I know when she passed away, but how was she active until the end of her life, or was this just part of her earlier life?
Basically, she had this fall in 1949, which was a really, really bad fall. And so then she would have been 54, and she never really recovered from that. So she became much less active after that. You know, she was always out and about, hobbling with her stick, and doing things and fetching wood and water and things like that. And then once she got evicted from her home in 1953, so in her late 50s, I think after that she became much more of a recluse. She was very religious all her life. That's one thing that's very clear, and, you know, very devoted and dutiful person. And she, every week, she would walk to church, quite a long walk, even, you know, though she was very lame and could only walk with a stick, she would sort of make that journey there and back. But really, apart from that, she didn't really go out much. I think it was, you know, it was a bit like living permanently under lockdown for nearly 30 years, because she wasn't really welcome in communist society, and she wasn't in the best of health either. So it came from sort of first 2/3 of her life. But in fact, her peak speed, her years of sporting achievement were really middle age rather than what you'd normally consider someone's sporting prime.
Thanks.
It looks like we have a question from Barbara. If you'd like to ask it. Maybe.
I'm not hearing.
No, I don't think. If you can type it. She had her hand raised, so that's why I was.
Oh, Barbara's connected to audio. Okay.
Yeah, she's gonna. Oh, I see. All right. Well, I see. Yeah, please ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much for giving this talk. I wondered, how did you first become interested in Lata? I mean, how did this start, your interest in her?
It started entirely accidentally. Basically, the sport I'm mainly interested in, as Teresa mentioned at the beginning, is running. And a few years ago, I did a biography of Emil Zatopek. And so that was when I first went to the Czech Republic and started meeting people in the world of Czech and Czechoslovak sport, and learning about the history of sport in the 20th century, and learning to speak basic Czech, and, you know, all that sort of thing. And it was right at the end of my work on that book, I just happened to come across a little mention on I was sort of listening to Czech podcasts trying to improve my Czech, and so I had this little mention, yes, just a couple of sentences about this woman who'd once won the race. I thought, that sounds a bit strange. I'd like to find out more, maybe, because I'm a journalist, so I thought maybe I could write an article about this. So then I started researching on the internet and found members of her family who live in her old home, and so I contacted them, and then I just gradually realized that no one really knew anything much about her story, and so it just sort of drew me in step by step, and each clue led to another clue, and everyone you spoke to was really interested in it and really keen to, you know, help me. So it was actually a really enjoyable but quite long drawn out bit of detective work, of digging up this story that had really vanished. But yeah, I came across it by accident. It's a simple answer.
A very good accident.
Yes, I'm really grateful for it. Yeah, a lucky accident, to call it. Yeah.
I think we lost Barbara, but actually you were talking about your book, We Die a Little Each Day. Can you share, one of the questions was, can you share about your experience writing that book?
I had a great experience writing Today We Die a Little. Partly it was the whole experience of just discovering Czech culture from the first time, from the very first time I arrived on Czech soil and literally didn't speak a word of Czech, and I couldn't even find where I was going. And when I tried to ask for directions, I couldn't understand the directions I was being given. And then gradually just getting to know people, getting to know Emil Zatopek's widow, Dana Zartopkova, who became a really good friend, who very sadly died earlier this year. And then gradually, in my, I always loved the story of Emil Zatopek because to Westerners, he came across as this wonderful, hospitable, generous-spirited Czechoslovak person who was like the opposite of all the Western caricatures of the cold, evil communist from the Eastern Bloc. He was this really humane person. And for me, writing about Emil Zatopek was all about sort of discovering Czech hospitality and learning to love the Czech way of life. So it was a very educational experience, and I learned all sorts of unexpected things, but again, a really enjoyable one.
Great. Do we have any other questions? We still have 10 minutes technically, so anyone wants to ask anything?
I was going too fast in the story.
Yeah, that's okay.
Too long.
Let's see. Otherwise, I do just want to remind everyone, if you haven't purchased his book yet, we do have it in the museum store. And they also will include, he was very gracious to send us his signature on a book plate. So that will be included with it as well. And I did share that link, and I'll be sending out this recording to everyone with that information. Jessica, did you have a question?
Yeah. Is there any chance this book will be turned into a movie? Is that on the...
I really hope so. I think it would make a great movie. It seems to, it combines all these movies like sort of, National Velvet and Downton Abbey and all these sort of things mixed up. Plus, it's true. I think someone has taken out not a short option on it, and I don't know how they're doing with that, or if that will come to anything. But no, I'd really, really like it to be a movie, and it's just such a great story, and it lends itself to film. Though obviously you have to find an actress who's prepared to do a bit of dangerous riding. But I think it could be done. And again, I think there's so many people in the Czech Republic who would like to see the story told that I think it could be done, and I hope it will.
If it were to become a movie, would you be interested in writing that screenplay, or would you just want someone to adapt it for you?
I don't know. I've never written a screenplay. I think it's probably a lot harder than it sounds. And I think the other thing is that, I mean, although I think the story I tell in Unbreakable is, is meant to sort of read like a novel, or be quite exciting, but it is all true. And I think when you've gone to all that trouble to find out what is true and what isn't true, and what you can't know, it's very hard to depart from that. I think people who write film scripts just take all sorts of liberties, and they just make things up and leave things out. I think I would find it quite painful to do that. So
Yeah, I
probably
can see
leave it to
that.
someone else.
Definitely. Yeah, that would be a very different experience. One last question we had is, do you have any plans for future books?
I do have various plans for future books. I would like to do another Czech one, but I haven't come up with an excuse. The trouble is, after I finished my Emil Zatopek book, I promised my family that my next book I could do in England, and I wouldn't have to keep properly. And then I came up with Lata's story, so I have to take it a bit easy next time. I did actually recently co-write a book about a Czechoslovak exile. I don't know if you can see it where I am. Called Tom Karan, who used to live in Brno, who
Oh.
fled in 1939. He probably wouldn't mean so much to Americans, though. He became an incredibly successful and influential designer of just about everything that the British used from the 1970s to the 1980s. But yes, I'm not sure. My next book that I'm working on at the moment actually is about old runners. So I've gone back to running, but I would very much like to have an excuse to go back to the Czech Republic again.
Well, we hope so someday, because these two stories, are so important, obviously, to us here at the NCSML. So we really appreciate it. Like I said, we will be sending this out to all of you and everyone that signed up so you can access it, as well as, I really encourage you all to buy his book and read it so you can read Lata's full story. Richard, any parting words before we sign off today?
I don't know actually. No, I'm sorry. I was worried that I was going to go. It was going to take too long to tell. There were so many pictures, so I was going at high speed. So I hope I haven't left anything out. There's lots more to the story than that. But to me, what's so fascinating about Lata Brandisová's story, and what's so fascinating also about Emil Zotopek's story, is that they're both basically the story of a nation. And I've no idea how all the people who are involved in your museum see the story of Czechoslovakia. But to me, it is the story of Czechoslovakia in 20th century is a sort of very beautiful, sometimes horrible, tragic story, but also very inspiring one. And it just has so much human drama in it that it's a wonderful theme to write about. And I think it's, the stories of Czechoslovakia are just well worth keeping alive. And so, I guess what you're doing at the museum is very worthwhile and important work. Keep it up. That's my message.
Thank you. I feel like that is a perfect statement to end on. So thank you again, everyone, for being here today. And thank you, Richard, for joining us. And we look forward to, maybe hearing from you in the future about some other Czech related topics as well.
Very happy to, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. And
Richard, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. It's been great having you. And
bye.
Have a wave now. Yeah.